Happy May the 4th. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, let me thank you for joining us for the launch of our report, Maintaining Momentum in National Security Space. We're very pleased to be launching this second set of recommendations as we are seeing the beginnings of a new presidential administration. So the timing for an updated set of recommendations on national security space is very good. Our recommendations are part of a program at CSPC that we've been delving into for over 3 years. We've had several hundred participants convened from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, 2 Secretaries of the Air Force, other senior Space Force and Space Command leaders, key actors from the commercial space sector and NGOs to talk about how we can work to maintain America's preponderance in the increasingly contested domain of space. Our goal was to convene these conversations in order to create actionable recommendations that our space community could implement. And we believe we've done that. Over the course of the past year, we've seen a marked increase in attention on space. One of the manifestations of that was the creation of the Space Force, as it has begun to cement its structure, build out its mission, and define its culture. We have focused on ways we think that can be enhanced, particularly focusing on the cultural element. And it is our hope that through leveraging the newness of the organization, we can achieve some reformation of the bureaucracy that tends to slow government projects. We also understand that one of the important aspects of the continued development of the Space Force is coordination on space issues, both within the defense establishment and with other federal agencies to create a rules-based order for space. Some of our key findings included, probably unsurprisingly, a focus on acquisition and how the government buys the products and services that will help keep America strong in space. I was pleased to see the president nominated Frank Kendall to be Secretary of the Air Force, someone with deep experience in defense acquisitions issues. One of the key recommendations that we put forward also had to do with communication and educating Congress and the American public on the threat and the importance of space, not only to our national security, but to our day-to-day lives. And as former members of Congress, Mike Rogers and I think, are particularly sensitive to the importance of keeping the American public bought in and engaged on the need to invest appropriately in space. We usually try to remind people how dependent we all are, even with just cell phone technology, on GPS and other satellite-based systems, which wouldn't be there if it weren't for national security space. But the challenge of keeping Congress and the public engaged on the issue is a perpetual one, and it's one where we feel like the center can be particularly helpful. We also focus on coordination with the commercial space sector, as the commercial space sector is where all the innovation is coming. And that is the good news side, very much the good news side of the story. Every time there is public press attention on an interesting new rocket technology, it's a very visible manifestation for the public of the promise of rapidly advancing space-related technologies, and that's great. But we also want to keep people focused on the totality of some of the key questions. I just want to thank, at the outset, Program Director Joshua Huminski, who is the director of the Mike Rogers Center for Intelligence and Global Affairs at CSPC, and who is really responsible for the bringing together of the actors for this project and the capturing of the key recommendations. So thanks to Joshua. Thanks also to Dan Mahaffey, our Senior Vice President of Policy, our key supporters, among them teams at the Dr. Scholl Foundation, Blue Origin, NanoRacks, and Rocket Labs, who were not only contributors, but also very much intellectual partners and engaged on our conversations. And I'd like to say a very special thanks to my bipartisan partner in this effort, Chairman Mike Rogers, former chair of the House Intelligence Committee, for really breathing life into this program and for working together with me side by side as a bipartisan team to ensure that our recommendations are accepted across the national security community as very balanced and bipartisan. That's the way we always operate. Mike, it's been a pleasure working with you. At this time, I want to turn it over to Mike Rogers for his comments.
Well, thanks, Glenn. And it truly has been we decided early on that if we couldn't get the bipartisan bit right, this report would go nowhere. And it's easy to do with Glenn. Glenn's doing a great job and is a great leader for the CSPC. So thanks for all of that and allowing the report to go as well as it has. I think Glenn did a great job outlining all of the scope and depth of people that we talked about in this report. And we think this is different because we did believe, both Glenn and I and Joshua and others at CSPC, that we wanted to do a document that actually produced some results, both at the administration and DOD and in Congress. And I think we've done that. And I think you're going to see that because we kept quiet about it for most of the time we were doing the report, which is unusual in Washington, D.C. But we took a lot of input from a lot of players in this space. And if you think about how important this is, the last decade for space, to me, has been both spectacular and a little bit concerning. Our adversaries have developed anti-satellite technology, but not only did they develop it, but they've operationalized it. They understand, our adversaries, that the United States' strength on the battlefield, even commercially, is because our space dominance. And they understand that they now have ways that they can disrupt that position in the world on our dominance in space. So space is now contested like other domains. And so we wanted to go and make sure that either now with the Space Force, we either get this right or we damn ourselves to second and third place for the next generation of Americans. And we just thought it was just too important to let that happen. And so all the things that you're going to hear about, speed to operationalize, launch tempo, resilience, our development of countermeasures, things that we're going to work on here in the future, government commercial speed to launch and replacement and resiliency, all of the things that we know, and both government, both parties, and the private sector all know the way forward on this. Now we just have to kind of put it together in a way that says, this is urgent, and we have to do this collaboratively, not only here in the United States, but internationally. So I'm looking forward to the report. Thanks again, Glenn, for allowing us to do so much on this and being such an important part of it. And I'm going to turn it over to Joshua. And by the way, the panelists today are great and have been very, very helpful in influencing at least how we look at the future of commercial space and how important it's going to be to the national security efforts of the United States. And so for that, I'm very thankful for Lars and Brett and others. I think it's just going to be a well received, and we're going to get real action on this. I can't emphasize this enough. This will be an actionable report. This is not just a report that goes on someone's desk somewhere at the Capitol building or DOD. We're going to take action to try to make these things possible because we believe that much that it will impact and assist our ability to make sure that we're dominant in space. The United States and our allies are dominant in space. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. Thanks again, Glenn. Thanks to the panelists, and I'm going to turn it over to really who is the rocket engine of our report here, Joshua Huminski.
Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're very pleased and excited to release this report, which I think leverages the expertise of a broad and diverse group of experts from across the spectrum of government, the private sector, academia, and more. The reality is that the challenge facing the United States in space is not just security, but it's also economic and governance in nature. But unless we get that security portion of that triangle right, we risk ceding the primacy and leadership to America's adversaries. That's something we can't afford. We need a whole of government and a whole of nation approach. And this means closer integration and partnerships with the commercial sector in particular. This also means more competition. This means matching the speed of innovation with the speed of acquisition. It means creating new pathways for the integration of new technologies, especially as they come online, and especially as they come from over the horizon. It means thinking about new ways of doing business and new ways of operating in space. The Space Force alone can't do this. It can help drive the necessary change across the board, but it's not its sole purpose. It must work within the U.S. government and with America's partners and allies to ensure the establishment of a liberal, rules-based order on orbit and beyond. The promise and opportunities in and from space are exceptional. We now have a chance to define America's future in space, provided we make sensible and smart changes today. And we couldn't have done this report without, again, the great support from partners like Blue Origin, Rocket Lab, NanoRacks, and without the great leadership of both Chairman Rogers and Representative Glenn Nye. I'm very excited to release this report to the public and to have the speakers who are going to follow on. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan.
Thanks, Joshua. And I'll serve here to mainly be our MC for the panelists, as well as the Q&A we'll be getting from the audience here as well. So the first panelist I will turn it over to is Brett Alexander from Blue Origin. Thanks for joining us, Brett.
Oh, thank you. Great to be here. Thank you to CSPC, to Congressman Nye, Chairman Rogers, to you, Dan, and to Joshua for their efforts on this report. You know, the future of national security space will look significantly different from the past. You know, the threat has developed more rapidly than expected. Space superiority can no longer be assumed. And in discussing why the U.S. Must maintain its advantages in space, General Raymond, Chief of Space Operations, said, "Our adversaries are moving deliberately and quickly in order to reduce our advantage." So the national security community is in the early stages of rethinking how we deliver capabilities from space, what future space architectures will look like, how we protect our space capabilities, and how we stay ahead of adversary threats. And it's clear that the advent of reusable boosters, competition replacing monopoly, the proliferation of small launch systems, and innovation are changing the face of launch. National security launch resisted competition to a single monopoly provider for more than a decade. And with the introduction of a second provider, now looks to a decade or more of duopoly. Yet Rand has warned that a two-provider acquisition strategy poses, quote, significant risk that China, India, or Japan enter or expand their participation in the commercial market, further reducing U.S. firms' market share. The high-walled garden approach with all eggs in one or now two baskets may be appropriate when spacecraft are exquisite, rare, expensive, and launches are correspondingly few. But to stay ahead of rapidly developing threats, we need faster development of more types of spacecraft and more launch options. So the proliferation of launch capabilities is a good thing for national security, and we hope the Space Force will take advantage of this rapidly developing commercial launch capability. As the CSPC report notes, acquisition of launch should shift from the high-walled garden approach of today to one where providers, once certified, compete for launches on an individual or small group basis. We hope the Space Force will welcome this sort of dynamic and innovative commercial launch environment, its ability to enable America to meet the threat to our space capabilities as our space architectures adapt. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Brett. I'll now ask our next panelist from NanoRacks, Jeffrey Manber, to join us.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Chairman Rogers, and thank you, CSPC, for putting out this report. It is indeed timely, and I'm sure with the sophistication of the rollout, it will not just be another report that goes nowhere. And before I begin, just some thoughts on what we're focused at NanoRacks and our concerns. Let me also say I could not be more pleased so far with the beginning of the new administration. The keeping of the Space Council, I think, is an extremely important development. Up to now, as we all know, Space Council has sort of been a Republican tool. And it's wonderful to see it now become more part of the U.S. government approach. And what it says is that there is no one agency that should be the voice for space. And we at NanoRacks will go further and say there should be no one hardware, sort of what Brett, my friend Blue Origin, was saying, and no one architecture. And at the same time, we look forward to working with the Space Force, the Space Council, as we look beyond launch vehicles. And I note that most of everybody on the on the panel will be talking about launch vehicles, and we at NanoRacks are focused on the destinations. What can we do with in-space hardware? How do we repurpose existing hardware to meet the future threats and opportunities that we face? And what we feel at NanoRacks is that we must be more agile, we must be more cost efficient, and above all else, we have to, like the adversary, think long term, but implement in the short term. And so for us, we're focused on the resiliency that's possible for the reuse of in-space hardware. We see the flexibility and cost efficiencies from that. We are very, very pleased by the support that we're receiving from the government. It's difficult. I mean, the government has spent billions of dollars to give us a more robust space transportation system, and now there are folks in the community saying, "Wait a second, that's great, but it's not just about launch on demand. It may be about deployment on demand. It may be about extension of American sovereignty in ways that we have not done before." So we see this as an extremely important moment in our history for the use of space. We know that the competition, whether civil, commercial, or strategic, is real and growing. And so we really appreciate the report from the CSPC and look forward to talking about how do we move beyond access to space to more control of space. And that's what really we're about. So thank you.
Thanks, Jeffrey. And before I turn to our third panelist, I just want to remind the folks in the audience that if you do want to start submitting questions, we'll be using the Zoom Q&A function to solicit those today. So that's how we'll be doing questions. I'll look at those and relay them to the panel. So please do start putting them in there. But for now, I'll also turn over to hear from Lars Hoffman at Rocket Lab. Lars?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And good morning to everyone. And Congressman Nye and Chairman Rogers, thank you so much for hosting this panel discussion and the rollout of the report. And Joshua, the rocket engine behind the report, thank you so much for your dedication and your persistence and your thoughts going into this report to stimulate the discussion. And Dan, thank you for hosting the panel discussion today. So it's a pleasure to join my two colleagues and friends here on the panel today to talk about the significance of this report. And I'd like to also talk about the timeliness of this report. I think it couldn't have been more timely considering all that's happening globally today in space and national security space in particular. As has been noted repeatedly in a lot of reports that have been released recently, the threats are real, the threats are growing. Our adversaries are iterating and proliferating their space capabilities as rapidly as possible. So how do we in America respond to this? And it's going to take a multifaceted approach, as pointed out in the report. It's a whole of government approach. It is a whole of industry approach as well. And it's across the spectrum. It's not just launch, it's across as Jeffrey was pointing out, what do we do on orbit? How do we increase our capabilities on orbit to be more agile, more maneuverable, more capable? And so it's going to take this kind of innovation, which is the competitive advantage of America, spurred by investment from both government and commercial industry, to develop these capabilities and to grow these capabilities and to iterate and innovate on these capabilities as rapidly as possible. To do that, we're going to need to continue the change and momentum that's underway right now. The stand-up of U.S. Space Command and U.S. Space Force is a big start and a move in the right direction, we believe. There's a lot of change afoot right now. We'd like to support this from an industry perspective. We'd like to be a participant and a part of this change that's going to help increase our national security in space. And then finally, the address of norms and behaviors in space. This is critical, and U.S. and America can take a leading role in this as well, whether it's the Artemis Accords from a civil perspective or in the national security side, leading the world in terms of setting those norms of behavior and ultimately, if required, to enforce those norms of behavior to maintain space as a productive commons for all to use. So at this point, I'll wrap my comments and say thank you once again for the opportunity to participate in the panel, to join my colleagues, and to join the leadership of CSPC, and thank you again for this opportunity.
Thanks, Lars. I see the first question here from Marcia Smith for Brett at Blue Origin. I'll go specifically with that one first. How do you want to see the government and DoD change launch services? No more block buys? How would you like that to change?
Well, I think thank you for the question, Marcia. I think the history is either a monopoly or a 5-year block buy, high walled garden, splitting between only 2 providers. I think the way the future should look is that there ought to be a wall that you have to get through. You have to be certified. You have to be able to provide a certain degree of mission assurance to the national security community, but then they ought to be competing launches based on individual launches or small blocks, not these 5-year large contracts. And I think the rationale for that is that the spacecraft are changing; they're going to be developed more rapidly, and the launch capability should match what the space what's needed in space, not just a guaranteed block buy for a certain company or a couple of companies.
More broadly for the panel, a question comes up as we talk about norms. What does the private sector need to see in terms of norms? Because as Teresa in this question points out, governments often say norms for me, but not for thee. But what does that mean for the private sector, for developing the space economy to have those norms and rules? Jeffrey or Lars?
Yeah, I'll be glad to jump in here. So, one of the things that we've noticed over the last year is there's been an increasingly crowded low Earth orbit, especially regime, that is impacting our ability to reach space. So, whereas we used to have multiple hour-long launch windows, we now are seeing that divided up into smaller and smaller segments because the low Earth orbit and regime are getting more and more crowded. And so, the traditional requirement for orbital debris mitigation and standards practices is 25 years to deorbit any debris that you may have left on orbit, and that may have been fine, in the previous decades. It's not necessarily fine today. And so responsible behavior would be that you are leaving only your payloads on orbit, and that you've got a end-of-life plan for both the payloads that are on orbit, but also all of the launch vehicle and other hardware that is used to deliver those payloads to orbit, and both a proactive approach to deorbiting that debris in a responsible way. So this is an area that is starting to become almost urgent here as we go forward and see thousands of satellites delivered to low Earth orbit, all good and delivering much needed capability, but also becoming more and more of a challenge. And if the U.S. doesn't take a leadership role on this, then other countries around the world who are growing their access to space are not going to necessarily feel obligated to follow any norms.
Dan, may I follow through on what Lars is saying?
Please do.
Okay, so the way we look at it, and first let me say that I'll echo Lars, it's getting more crowded. Where our perspective is from the perspective of space stations and destinations. And so we're confronting a situation. NanoRacks has been on the International Space Station for 10 years. We've worked, and the U.S. government has worked very well with Russia during that time. How long is that going to last? What are the norms of communication? What are the norms of what to do in different situations? I think as we look out in the next decade, you're going to see 4, 5, 6 free flyers, small space stations China will have one or two. Russia will have several. Hopefully, we in this country will have a whole bunch of commercial platforms. And so, how do we handle that? How do we avoid conflict? What are the rules of the road? As always, we look at it from a slightly different perspective, and that is of destination. But I'll say one other thing. We believe in cooperation. As you look at mature markets, obviously we face the challenge from China. We face the threat from Russia, terrestrial threats and those in space. But I personally believe in cooperation in the civil and the commercial. And I think we have to keep companies in the room. We have to keep the door open. It's the best way to understand the adversary, is to understand how they think and where their priorities are. So by establishing these international norms, in our case, in destinations and space stations, it lays the framework for understanding the other side and making sure that you don't have another Cuban Missile Crisis. So this is an extremely important area.
I would add that, I believe strongly in cooperation as well, strongly in commercial space, establishing norms. I think on the national security side, norms need to be established as well. General Raymond and others have talked about a number of incidents where near-peer adversaries have approached U.S. government spacecraft, have deployed things, have done things that are not in general friendly, but the intent is not always known, right? There are no norms of how you should behave. It's clear on the seas that when naval forces are near each other, there are norms of behavior. They aren't always applied. We saw a ship pass in front of one of ours recently. I can't remember the nationality, but that was a provocative act, and it was seen as provocative. And so in space, it's no different. We need to understand what those norms are and know what is provocative and what the intent behind it is, because space is changing rapidly. That's why I go back to the launch side needing to change. Everything in space is changing, and so we need to be ahead of the curve, not behind the curve. And standards of behavior are part of that process.
And quickly, too, just as we see some of these stories, how do these standards fit into the competitiveness of these providers when some launch providers may just leave their debris falling down, or perhaps a 30-ton core stage tumbling in orbit currently?
Well, I think we have to have standards that apply across the board, right? We can't really force foreign commercial companies to abide by certain rules, but we also don't let them necessarily launch U.S. spacecraft, right? And so if the U.S. is the leader in the world, then others do follow.
Yeah, and I think industry realizes this is in their own best interest, and it's space is not that different from other industries, and certainly the physics are a bit different, but the norms and standards that have been developed in all other industries and all other areas of our economies and life can be found in analog in space. And so, if we don't act responsibly as commercial space companies or as a spacefaring nation, then it could ultimately come back and bite us in the long term. All it takes is a couple of collisions in space, and you start to trash the environment, and then space becomes less and less usable or unusable in certain orbits and certain regimes. If you start to trash low Earth orbit, it becomes increasingly difficult to get beyond low Earth orbit. So it is to all of our best interests, both as companies, as industry, and as a country, to take a leadership role in this and to really help establish and follow those norms and standards that benefit not just us, but benefit all users of space.
From a historical perspective, I was on the sidelines several decades ago when we brought the Proton and the Russians into the international satellite launch market. And the discussions were very difficult because the American government at the time sought to link it to a whole range of geopolitical issues. And we, being Americans, we were fortunate that it was a weakened Russia. And there was a lot, this is 94, 95, about then. And the Russians, by and by, were very good negotiators, and we worked out a very good agreement that allowed ILS and the Russians to play by international norms and international rules. But I would put in the caution that as we go forward, that we can't link it. We have to, as Lars says, this is a real industry now. And it has to rise and fall on its own merits, and there should be, the incentive on the part of the sovereign government as to why they should obey international norms. There has to be trust. There has to be transparency, and so these agreements do not happen overnight. And we're not going to have international norms in space in the near future, given so much mistrust. So I think you do begin with cooperation, however small, and you agree on the end goals. And if what I saw in the 90s is any guide, it will be possible. It will be possible with India, and who the heck knows with China. But it is possible to create these geopolitical, industry-based international norms. And I would just ask that we not link it to other geopolitical issues, and you keep it industry, focused.
That's a good point. And another question I have, and Lars, I'll go to you first on this one, is in working with government beyond, DIU, AFWorks, SpaceWorks, how can government adjust processes to better take advantage of commercial innovation? And even with these efforts, what are the roadblocks you still see?
Yeah, it's when we talk with our government partners, especially in the acquisition field, it's challenging, and they're frustrated just as well. A lot of it comes back to the development and growth of the DoD 5000 series acquisition regulations that they have become what they have become for a lot of good reasons over many decades. And so we have to play within that rule book, within those regulations, and so that does limit some of the speed at which acquisition can move. And you're talking about programs that are in the hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars, and so we as taxpayers should want the government to act responsibly and with due diligence as they go through these solicitations and acquisitions. But the encouraging things that we're seeing over the last couple of years is an openness to other ways to move fast, and maybe the government almost acting as a venture capitalist in some ways, where they can take bets and place small bets across the board within industry to try and seed innovation and move at a speed that's not been seen in the past, and maybe help on-ramp new entrants into some of these larger programs. So there is room for hope, and also in seeing with development of Space Force and the Space Systems Command out here at Space and Missile Systems Center, watching Space and Missile Systems Center evolve over the last few years to SMC 2.0 and their new organizational structure. They're making every attempt to try and move faster and to foster innovation and acquisition in new ways that are still operating within the DoD 5000 series for certain programs, but also allowing ways through the Space Enterprise Consortium, through DIU as a partner, through AFWorks and other programs to on-ramp some of these new ideas and new entrants in ways that previously weren't available. So it's encouraging, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens here over the next year with the stand-up of Space Systems Command and with the partnership with other organizations that move quite fast, like Space Rapid Capabilities Office, like Air Force Research Lab, and others that are wanting to run at the speed of industry, but have previously not really had the acquisition tools to be able to follow through on that. So there is a lot of encouragement, but there's also a lot of inertia being implemented by the traditional acquisition regulations?
We sometimes, live in our own silos, but, stepping back, I'm hopeful a little bit that the horrific experience of COVID will teach the government something. And you see the speed at which the United States has moved. You see the benefit that we as a society gained from the speed versus our friends in Europe and elsewhere. And I'm hopeful that as you're sitting in the White House today in Congress, you see the value of moving quickly. And how long everybody here on this meeting this morning? How long have we discussed ITAR? How long do we recognize the challenges and problems of ITAR? It's not what it was conceived to be, and yet we don't seem to be able to really allow industry to, we've made progress, but to allow industry to move forward in a mature way and a safe and prudent way. But I'm a little bit hopeful that as we emerge from this pandemic, one of the lessons will be you can move forward and be the government. And so let's see if that is one of the lessons.
The next question I'll turn to, and I'm going to turn to Chairman Rogers and Glenn here. It's from Teresa as well, asking how we might make this report actionable, talking to members of Congress and their staff. Beyond that, beyond Joshua and I getting our shots and Mike and Glenn sending us to the Hill, how else are we going to be making this actionable? Chairman Rogers.
Thanks, Dan. Well, a couple of ways. So one of the things that we learned through the whole process of this report is that the way we onboarded information, we built up a level of credibility that we weren't out to, we had no dogs in the fight, and we were more interested in trying to find the problems and the pinch points and offer solutions for them. And again, Glenn did a great job outlining the sheer scope and depth of people that we talk to try to onboard and ingest information about how we get this thing right. So we're going to take this report back, not just to the Hill. If it's just to the Hill, I think it'll be a failure. But State Department, it's also, all the things in that report that says, hey, we have to work with our partners and our allies. Great. We need to engage the State Department, and we will do that. So we'll brief them on the report, walk through what solutions we think. And we also have the capability to convene a really large swath of really talented and knowledgeable people on all of the sectors of which we are going to engage. And so, yes, it'll be Congress. We're going to brief. We're going to work through the problem sets. We're going to help them try to get it to a place where it ends up in legislation. IDIQ might be an example of that. I talked about the State Department. Same with acquisition in the Space Force. It's easy to talk about, really hard to do. If acquisition was an easy fix, we wouldn't be in the shoes that we are. And what the overwhelming reaction is for easy is to take what they know and plop it over on what we're doing in space. And again, if we do that, we will fail. We, the United States, will fail. Because we don't allow this rapid ingestion of technology. We don't allow for rapid tempo of satellites and all of the aspects of the report. So it will be broad. It will be in depth. We can convene the people that we need to convene for the players that will have say across the government departments. And it'll be fairly robust. That's how we think we're going to get it done. If it were one place, one report, one drop, again, we think we would be a failure. So we're not going to do that. We're going to take all of this great intellectual capital on this topic, lots of experience. We're going to take all their bruised knuckles and their scars on their back from the commercial sector getting to where they are today and try to turn that into something really positive across the government. That's where we think we play a really important role in this. And again, it wouldn't work in that way normally, Teresa, if we didn't build the credibility of, listen, we're not here pitching one thing. We're here trying to tell you that we've accumulated this knowledge. And by the way, in accumulating it through the government, we provided forums where the government could say, we know this part doesn't work very well. We're scratching our heads. Hard to do in a big public forum, but that's where we got. And so that report now goes back, and we really think we could make a difference with it. So, Glenn, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, just to add to that, we understand that with the creation of a new bureaucracy comes some turf battling, and we witnessed some of that. But we also feel like there are opportunities with the newness of a large organization in its potential willingness to think anew and to try to implement reforms that we'd love to see implemented across government bureaucracies, but are very hard over time. And so we're trying to time these recommendations to be actionable in the sense that we have the opportunity with the relative newness of the Space Force, with a new administration coming in, so some new leaders, not necessarily completely new to the defense establishment, but now part of a new administration. So with the ability to try to move quickly in the early days. And I do want to emphasize that the importance of the convening aspect here. The actionability of these recommendations don't necessarily come simply from the fact that we tried to make them less of simply an observation on the difficulty of some of these problems or the importance of some of the problems, but more on a set of recommendations that we thought actors could put into implementation relatively quickly. In addition to that, the convening is a very important part of it. It's not just sending the report over; it's bringing together the players, and we will continue to do that, largely because what we found through the history of this program over 3 years was there were relationships that were created on the fringes of some of our in-person convenings that resulted in action. Sometimes it was within government actor to government actor. Sometimes it was government to private. Sometimes it was private to private. But the gathering of people in a room and the talking through of the challenges led to motion. And we thought that was really important. Just like everybody else last year, we have had to deal with the challenge of moving largely to electronic. There's great value in it, but there's also a loss in some of that personal relationship development, which is just an important part of the nature of human interactions. One of the convenings we did, which we thought was quite interesting in the past, was bringing the Secretary of the Air Force over to the Hill, and in a non-adversarial, nonpartisan, non-government hosted discussion, really got into some great detailed discussion about some of the ways Congress could support initiatives on the defense side that we thought were very valuable. And we think those kind of conversations will be extremely important going forward. And like many others, we're looking forward to getting back to doing some of that in-person convening again, because we see that as probably one of the best ways to get these recommendations in motion.
Thanks, Glenn. We're getting up towards the end of our time here, but I see one very important question from a VIP, Sander Brown, who's 7 years old and appears to be skipping first grade Zoom for this. Big fan of space and Star Wars. He wants to ask the panel, what will future rocket technology look like, and what is your favorite Star Wars movie?
Here, I'll go first there. Thanks for the question, and thanks for your interest on this. I think future rocket technology will highlight reusability, fully reusable systems. You see first stages that are landing from space now. I think we'll have second stages, upper stages that are reusable. I also think you'll have upper stages that do other things in space. So they drop off a primary payload, a satellite in one orbit, and can move to another orbit and drop off another payload, and can stay up there and do multiple things over time. So I do think that what we see from a rocket, while it may look the same on the outside, will be doing a lot more things and be coming back and being reused. And in terms of what my favorite Star Wars movie is, I guess you'd have to call me an originalist. I'd have to go with Episode 4, the original, which I saw when it was in the theaters back in 1977. It was so different from anything anyone had seen before. It really did, start the whole genre of movies similar to it. And so that's definitely my favorite. Great question. And good luck to you.
Lars, I'll take it, Lars, from here. But let me say, first off, may the force be with you. We're back in the office now because we're vaccinated, and half of us have addressed in Star Wars and all sorts of things. So first off, it never gets old, and so when I do go to a Star Wars movie, it's great to see the ages. I mean, you got kids your age, and you got guys like us who are there just enjoying it. So it's great that you reach out to us. I mean, for me, the future is so exciting. It's space stations. It's people living and working in space. It's not being shocked that you'll meet somebody soon who has been to space or spent time in space, and one day you'll go to space. And unless you're a real nerd, which you may be, you won't focus as much on the rocket and what type of rocket. Just as maybe when you go on a vacation with your family, you don't really obsess over, is it an Airbus or is it a Boeing? So hopefully, with all due respect to my friends at Rocket Lab and Blue and everything else, we want a time when you just get on that rocket and you go to the space station, and maybe it's a hotel, maybe it's a laboratory, maybe it's you're going to the moon, and all that's going to be part of your future. So I think it's real cool you're skipping school to do this. Don't tell your mom, or I hope she knows. I hope your dad knows that you're doing this, and it's way cool. So just keep going, and we are doing our best to make sure your future is filled with opportunities in space and living and working. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think if we're all honest, we're all space geeks at heart. Many of us were inspired growing up watching the real life adventures of the Apollo program and the shuttle program, and getting to meet some of those astronauts in person, and seeing today our return to space from U.S. soil and return from space just the other day. It's inspiring, and it's almost unbelievable. But there's a lot of movies came out growing up that also inspired, whether it was 2001 Space Odyssey and certainly Star Wars. My favorite always has been the original that came out in 1977. And, when I first saw that, I was just blown away. Actually was growing up in an Air Force family. My dad was a test pilot, so I was around some pretty fantastic vehicles and pretty awesome people flying those vehicles. And so, it took a lot to really wow me, but that movie wowed me, and it always stuck with me. There's something I always wanted after watching that movie was a lightsaber. I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. Well, guess what? I finally got around to it, and I've got my own lightsaber today. So I wish you the best in following your adventures growing up, and may the force be with you.
That's awesome, Lars. Let me just add, Dan, for Sanders' benefit, I thought Empire Strikes Back is still my favorite, with Rogue One as a close second. But if anyone on this call is not watching the Apple Plus show For All Mankind, I've kind of gotten into that lately, and I figured this is the community of people who would find that show particularly interesting. So I'll give that my recommendation as well.
Well, with that, I think we've covered our questions. We're a little bit past our time. I want to thank our panelists, thank the audience, thank Joshua again for his work on this. And Glenn, I'll turn it back to you.
Again, I'll reiterate the thanks to all of our participants. The report was very much a product of a lot of intellectual input from folks across the space community. Again, commercial, NGO, government, including defense and civilian. And again, I just want to say thanks to Mike Rogers for his stewardship, and to Joshua Huminski for really being the driving force behind our progress. We look forward to continuing the good work together. Thank you.